Hello and welcome back. My name is John Dodson, and today's essay is titled Paralyzing Trauma: How Eveline Offers Resources to Heal Trauma Victims. We will be discussing the short story by James Joyce. It is only a few pages. I highly recommend that you read through it before coming to this. This essay is being approached with the idea that you understand and have already read the story. So, let's begin. Within literature, the field of trauma theory opens up the possibilities of texts to offer resources to survivors of trauma in their healing. In the short story Eveline by James Joyce, we see a survivor of domestic trauma trying to manage and understand her trauma as a man she doesn't fully know attempts to remove her from her traumatic situation. This is exemplary of what largely happens in services meant to help those who are healing from trauma. They enter a home, they remove the victim, it all makes sense. However, Eveline offers up potential resources to better help trauma survivors and avoid the paralysis that many survivors experience as a result of these services. Trauma theory in general is the use of literature to identify and understand the effect trauma has on narratives. It is seeing how trauma manifests in literature and how those manifestations show us the cultural impact that trauma, often historical trauma, has. It is also a look at how trauma is rendered within writing and how that might tell us equally much about what trauma is. As the Routledge Companion to Literature and Trauma puts it in Chapter 2, there are 4 types of trauma theory. The explicit, which most theories are based on, the implicit, underlying all approaches, the ways authors philosophize about trauma, and implicit trauma within a work. We will largely be working with Part 3 and 4, though none of these types are mutually exclusive, and almost all of them are used every time. One of the largest names in trauma theory, Kathy Carruth, describes trauma as a recurring wound of the mind. A story that was unknown upon affliction, but continues to horrify and follow the victim. Carruth notices that within literature, this repetition and the effects of trauma are often multiplied. Taking Carruth, I would then argue that this multiplication would allow for resources to easier be seen, and the effects of trying multiple techniques can be observed. It allows literature to offer a unique experience of qualitative understanding of trauma, rather than the clinical quantitative studies. Now, both have their place and both are very important, and only together can we see the full picture of how to properly assist those in traumatic circumstances. But I will be using the literary application of trauma theory more so than the clinical for proper analysis. I will then be moving to the clinical to describe resources and to show how this all comes together. What's important is that that is the theoretical framework I will be using for the course of this essay. Looking at the story of Eveline specifically, we see that it is clearly a text dealing with and working through trauma. Eveline states in rather matter-of-factly terms that she comes from an abusive household. She calls out her father numerous times for how he treats her. He's violent, misuses money, regularly insults and yells at her. He is obviously inflicting much trauma on Eveline. This manifests into her necessity of having a spot by the window that she can be herself at, and constantly remembering and reliving the moments of her mother's passing, which in her mind form the catalyst of all of the trauma that comes after. Then, when she is finally able to escape this trauma, she's able to run off with someone, anyone. Her father tries to stop her by disallowing her from seeing the sailor. Eveline is living within this traumatic space and within this abusive household. She is looking for any way out, but as her way out becomes barred, she rushes to find that escape, which then leads to the sailor's treatment of Eveline and her eventual paralysis. With the trauma of Eveline properly established, we now need to see how Eveline may offer resources to those looking to either help treat trauma or who need out of a traumatic situation themselves. In clinical psychology, it's commonly understood that removing an individual from the traumatic experience is the first step. However, it is also a common understanding that just removing an individual can lead to further trauma. This is so clearly seen in Eveline, who freezes when on the doorstep of suddenly leaving an experience that, while giving great pain and abuse, is also all she knows. One of the key resources Eveline can give those trying to help is what not to do. The Sailor is a brilliant example of this. Eveline knows so little about him that a quite popular reading of the character is that he's trying to take advantage of Eveline. This is directly opposed to what most clinical psychologists say needs to happen, which is building safe relationships and building a safe space. The Sailor hasn't built any relationship with Eveline, so when he tries to pull her out of that dangerous situation, she freezes up. The worst part is that Eveline already has a safe space, that window that she sits at that I discussed earlier. It's not only a safe space, but within that window, she has started constructing a narrative of her life, which is one of the other really important steps of healing from trauma on her own. This is how we see the Sailor break cardinal rules of trauma recovery despite presumably good intentions. I mean, he does the first thing we all would do, get Eveline out of there. However, despite what a good idea that may seem to be, and don't get me wrong, it is often an important and very necessary step, it ends up doing more harm than good in this case. Kruth also notes that within literature, the ability to retell an event is critical to the healing of a character. Just like how clinical psychology says building a narrative is an important step. So we see this breaking of the ability of Eveline to tell her narrative. We see the Sailor pull her out of the space where she was constructing this story of her own trauma and managing to spin together cause and effect of that. There we see the precipitation and the guarantee of the total paralysis that Eveline will later suffer. And due to this improper handling, Eveline experiences a mental breakdown because she's torn away from all she knows by someone she hasn't built a proper connection with yet. And Eveline, therefore, offers up resources in the form of what not to do and shows us the consequences of acting without thinking of the victim first. Eveline, the story, tells readers to be careful, to build a safe space for trauma victims, to build a proper relationship, to allow the victim to construct their own narrative. It offers us proper resources to assist with the healing and recovery of victims of trauma. Thank you.